Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. Edward here. Tell me, has the fog settled over your evening too, softening the lamps, hushing the street outside your window? Watson once watched a single, folded paper vanish from a locked room, and learned that certainty is often the thief's best disguise. Do subscribe that no fold, no seal, no quiet deception escapes you. Now draw near, for as Holmes believed, when the impossible is eliminated, what remains, however improbable, must be the truth. Find us always on the Watson's Margin Spotify channel. The link waits below. Chapter 1. The Gentleman in the Fog. It was, as I have occasion to recall, one of the densest fogs to settle upon London in the whole of that dismal November. A fog so thick and so yellow that it seemed less a natural vapour than some sullen breath exhaled by the city itself. I'd spent the better part of the afternoon visiting a former patient in Camberwell, a retired sea captain whose gout had lately grown troublesome, and I returned to Baker Street well after dark, my coat heavy with damp, and my thoughts pleasantly occupied with the prospect of a fire and a pipe. I found Holmes not before the fire, however, but bent over his chemical table, where he had arranged a curious assortment of materials, several sheets of legal parchment, a small dish of sealing wax softened over a spirit lamp, and strips of absorbent paper laid out in careful rows like specimens upon a naturalist's board. "You have caught me at an unglamorous hour, Watson," said he, without lifting his eyes from his work. "I am attempting to determine how long a wax seal, pressed under varying conditions of heat and pressure, retains the impression of the instrument used to make it. A dull inquiry, you will say, and yet I have known convictions to rest upon less. You have been at it some time, by the state of your sleeves. Since 3 o'clock. There is a certain satisfaction in work that asks nothing of me but patience." He set down a small brass seal, and regarded me with that quick, appraising glance which missed nothing. "You have been to see Captain Ferrers, I think, and his gout is no better for the weather." I had long ceased to marvel openly at such observations, though I confess I never ceased to feel their charm. "The mud of Camberwell is on my boots, I suppose, and you have reasoned the rest from my expression. From your left hand, rather, which you have been unconsciously massaging since you entered, in evident sympathy with a man whose own joints pain him. But I see you are chilled through. Sit by the fire, and Mrs. Hudson shall bring us something warm before we are interrupted, as I fully expect to be. You expect a visitor?" "I expect several things this evening, Watson, though I could not have named the hour until I heard, a moment before you arrived, a cab draw up in some agitation at the corner of the street, and a man descend from it who has twice paced the length of our railings without yet finding the courage to mount our steps." He had scarcely finished speaking when the bell rang below, and after a low murmur of conversation with Mrs. Hudson, quick footsteps ascended the stair. The door opened upon a young man of perhaps 30 years, well dressed in the sober black of his profession, but with a pallor about the cheeks and a restlessness in the eye that spoke of a night without sleep to come. "Mr. Holmes," said he, "I must apologise for this intrusion. I am Julian Harcourt, of Harcourt, Bellamy and Vane, solicitors, of Lincoln's Inn. I would not have troubled you at this hour, but a matter has arisen which threatens the gravest consequences, and I confess I do not know where else to turn. Pray sit down, Mr. Harcourt, and compose yourself with a glass of this excellent brandy before you attempt to compose your narrative. Dr. Watson's presence need not concern you. He is the sharer of all my confidences." Harcourt sat, though he did not touch the glass Holmes poured for him, and began his account in the halting manner of a man unaccustomed to disorder in his affairs. "You will perhaps have read something of the Merivale case, Mr. Holmes. Sir Claudius Merivale, the financier, stands accused of acquiring certain riverside properties through deeds we believe to have been forged. Our firm represents the plaintiffs in the matter. This afternoon the High Court granted an injunction restraining Sir Claudius from transferring or disposing of the disputed properties until the case can be heard in full. A significant order, Holmes observed, and one, I should imagine, that a man of Sir Claudius's resources would go to considerable lengths to circumvent. Precisely so. This signed injunction was delivered to our chambers under seal this evening, and placed for safe keeping in a locked deed room, to be formally served upon Sir Claudius tomorrow morning. Mr. Holmes, that document has vanished." "Vanished?" Holmes repeated softly, leaning forward with the particular stillness that I had learned to recognise as the surest sign of his interest. "Pray tell me everything, Mr. Harcourt, and omit nothing, however trivial it may seem to you." Harcourt described the deed room, the steel cabinet, the 3 keys held severally by himself, by the senior partner, Mr. Bellamy, and by the third partner, Mr. Adrian Vane. The discovery that morning that the red leather case remained locked within the cabinet, yet lay empty of its contents. He spoke of a copying clerk, one Nathaniel Croft, a man burdened with gambling debts, who had been seen near the rear passage after hours, and upon whom the police suspicion had already fastened. "Inspector Lestrade has been informed unofficially," said Harcourt, "and I fear he inclines already toward an arrest. But it was Mr. Vane, my partner, who urged me most strongly to come to you before matters proceed further. He has been a tower of steadiness throughout this whole wretched business, Mr. Holmes. Without his calm counsel, I do not know how I should have borne the evening at all." Holmes had risen and stood now with his back to the fire, his long fingers pressed together beneath his chin. "You say the document vanished from a locked room, Mr. Harcourt, guarded by a door, a single high window, and no other aperture. That is a promising phrase, though I have generally found that a room is never so locked as its owner supposes. I will come to Lincoln's Inn in the morning and examine matters for myself. In the meanwhile, touch nothing in that deed room, and above all permit no one, however trusted, to assure you that the matter is already understood." "You suspect Croft, then?" "I suspect nothing yet, Mr. Harcourt. I have not even begun to observe." He turned to me with a faint private smile that I had come to know well. "Well, Watson, it appears our evening's chemistry must wait. We have, I think, a more interesting seal to examine than any I have made tonight, and a stranger impression to trace than wax has ever taken." Outside, the fog pressed close against the windows, blotting out the lamps of Baker Street, and I little guessed, as I watched Harcourt descend once more into that yellow gloom, how far its concealment would prove to extend into the affairs we were about to unravel. Chapter 2. The Locked Deed Room. Sleep did not come easily to me that night, and I suspect it came no more readily to Holmes, for when I descended to our sitting-room the following morning I found him already dressed, his breakfast untouched, a pencil sketch of a rectangular chamber laid out upon the table before him. "You have been reconstructing the deed room from memory," I observed, "before we have so much as seen it. A poor sketch is better than none, Watson," and Harcourt was more precise in his description than he knew. "One door, one window set high in the eastern wall, no fireplace, no other opening of any kind. A room, in short, built for the safe-keeping of paper rather than the comfort of persons. Eat quickly. We are expected within the hour, and I should not like Lestrade to have trampled every fact into confusion before we arrive." The offices of Harcourt, Bellamy and Vane occupied a narrow, dignified building in Lincoln's Inn, its brass plate polished to a discretion that spoke of old and careful money. We were admitted by a clerk whose face bore the strained look of a household in mourning, and shown at once to a small chamber at the rear of the premises, where Harcourt awaited us with 2 gentlemen I had not yet met. The elder of these, a spare white-haired man with spectacles pushed high upon his forehead, was introduced as Mr. Septimus Bellamy, the senior partner. The younger, perhaps 45, dark-whiskered and possessed of an easy, reassuring manner, was Mr. Adrian Vane. "Mr. Holmes," said Vane, extending his hand with what struck me as genuine warmth. "I am heartily glad you have come. Harcourt has told us of your visit last evening. Whatever the truth of this unhappy business, I am persuaded that clear thinking will serve us better than panic, and I know of no clearer thinker in London." "You're generous, Mr. Vane, though I have not yet earned the compliment. Perhaps you would first describe to me, in your own words, the movements of the Injunction from the moment it entered these offices." Vane complied readily. He explained that the document had come from the court that afternoon in his own custody, he having attended to receive it on the firm's behalf, and that he had delivered it directly to Bellamy, who had placed it within a red leather document case and locked it, in the presence of both partners, inside a steel cabinet standing against the northern wall of the deed room. "There are 3 keys," Bellamy added, in a voice as dry and precise as his appearance suggested. "I hold one upon my own ring, as does Mr. Vane. The 3rd is kept for emergencies in a sealed envelope within Mr. Harcourt's desk, to be opened only should both Mr. Vane and I be simultaneously unavailable." "And who sealed that envelope?" "I did myself some months ago when the arrangement was first adopted." Holmes nodded and turned to Harcourt. "You told me last night that you returned unexpectedly at 8 o'clock. "I had forgotten a brief I required for the morning," said Harcourt, colouring slightly, as though the admission still embarrassed him. "I let myself in with my own key to the outer door. The deed room itself I did not enter, for I had no need of anything within it, but I passed close by and the door appeared quite undisturbed, locked as it should be." "And this morning?" "This morning Mr. Bellamy unlocked the cabinet to prepare the injunction for service, and found the red case within it exactly as it had been left. But when he opened the case itself," Harcourt's voice failed him for a moment, "it was empty, Mr. Holmes. The injunction was gone." We were shown into the deed room itself, a narrow, windowless-seeming chamber whose single aperture, high in the eastern wall, admitted a thin grey light through glass thick with the grime of the fog. Detective Inspector Lestrade stood within, notebook in hand, and greeted Holmes with a particular blend of respect and impatience that characterised their long acquaintance. "You've come to look over my shoulder, I suppose, Mr. Holmes, though I fancy there's little enough left to see. I've as good as settled the matter already." "Then you will not object to my settling it independently, Lestrade, and comparing our conclusions afterward." "Settle away. It's plain enough for any man with eyes. There's a clerk here, name of Croft, deep in debt to the bookmakers, who's been asking questions about this very injunction, who copied papers touching on the Merivale business not a fortnight past, and who was seen slipping out by the rear passage well after the offices should have been empty. A caretaker saw him, and this very week Croft has come into money he cannot account for." "A tidy case," said Holmes mildly, "and tidiness in these matters sometimes troubles me more than confusion. Tell me, Inspector, was the injunction folded, or was it pinned or bound in any way?" Lestrade glanced toward Bellamy, who answered for him. "Folded once, Mr. Holmes, as is customary, and placed loose within the case. It was never pinned or stitched to anything." "I thank you. And what manner of fog lay over the city last evening between the hours of 6 and 8? "The same wretched stuff as tonight," said Lestrade, "thick as gruel from Whitehall to the river. One question more, and I have done with generalities. Why, do you suppose was the red case left behind at all? A thief bold enough and clever enough to empty a locked cabinet without disturbing its lock might surely have carried away the case as easily as its contents, and saved himself the trouble of relocking anything." To this Lestrade had no ready answer, and I observed Vane's brow contract for the briefest instant, as though the question had struck him with more force than he cared to show, before his expression resumed its accustomed calm. "A fair point, perhaps," said Vane at last, "though I confess I see no great mystery in it. A frightened man does not always act with perfect logic." "Very true, Mr. Vane," Holmes replied, "though I have generally found that when a man acts against his own apparent interest, it is worth asking whether logic of a different and less obvious kind was guiding him instead." He turned toward the cabinet, drawing out his lens as he did so. "I will examine the room itself, if you have no objection, Inspector, before its atmosphere is further disturbed by our conversation. The theft of a document, after all, may prove a smaller matter than the theft of the time in which that document might safely have been used." And with that enigmatic remark, he knelt before the steel cabinet and began, with the minute and patient attention I had seen him bestow on stranger scenes than this, to examine every inch of a lock that Lestrade had already pronounced beyond suspicion. Chapter 3. 3 Grains of Sand. Holmes remained upon his knees before the steel cabinet for the better part of 20 minutes, and in all that while he spoke not a word save once to ask Bellamy for a second lamp, that he might examine the lock's interior mechanism by a clearer light. Lestrade occupied himself by consulting his notebook with an air of a man determined not to appear idle, while Harcourt hovered near the doorway, his hands working at one another in a manner painful to observe. "The lock has not been forced," Holmes announced at length, rising and dusting the knees of his trousers. "Nor has it been picked, so far as I can discover, though a lock of this age yields its secrets to the trained eye more readily than its makers would wish. There are no scratches about the keyhole beyond the ordinary wear of daily use." "I could have told you as much," said Lestrade. "You did tell me as much, Inspector, and I am obliged to you for confirming it independently. Let us examine the window." The window, set high in the eastern wall, proved upon inspection to be bolted fast from within, its latch thick with the undisturbed dust of long neglect. Holmes drew a chair beneath it, mounted with the agility that always surprised strangers unacquainted with his habits, and passed his lens slowly along the sill. "The soot without is untouched," he remarked, descending, "save by the fog itself, which has laid its own soft deposit evenly across the ledge. No hand has rested here, gloved or otherwise, in some considerable time. We may set this window aside, I think, as a means of entry or exit, though I do not yet set it aside as a means of information. Meaning, Lestrade, that a window may tell us something is impossible without telling us what is true, and the distinction is worth preserving." He turned now to the cabinet itself, and from within it drew the red leather document case, empty as it had been found, and carried it to the small table beneath the window, where the grey light fell most fully upon it. I watched him examine that case with the particular reverence he reserved for objects which had, in his phrase, witnessed a crime without being able to testify to it. He turned it over, opened it wide upon its hinge, and drew his lens across every seam of its lining. "Watson, come and look at this, though you must not touch." I bent close, and saw, caught beneath the stitching of the lining near one corner, 3-minute grains of some pale substance, scarcely visible without the aid of the glass. "Sand," said Lestrade, peering over my shoulder. "There's precious little strange in that, Mr. Holmes. Half the pavements of London carry grit enough to explain it." "Half the pavements of London, Inspector, are composed of grit considerably coarser and darker than this. Street sand carries with it always some trace of soot, of horse dung, of the 1,000 impurities of a city thoroughfare. These 3 grains are pale, uniform, and remarkably fine, of a character I have encountered before in the drying powder used by careful clerks to blot fresh ink before it can smear. Note also this." He indicated, with the tip of a pencil, a faint crescent-shaped indentation pressed into the leather near the case's centre. "And this. A single fibre, dark blue, no thicker than a hair, caught upon the small brass clasp. And here, along the clasp itself, a trace of moisture, though the case has by every account remained within a locked cabinet in a windowless room since it was last closed." "The fog," suggested Harcourt from the doorway. "Surely the fog might account for a little damp, Mr. Holmes." "The fog, Mr. Harcourt, could not have entered a locked cabinet in a sealed room any more readily than a thief could, and I think we have already agreed that no thief entered here. There is, further, a faint odour about the clasp, resembling bitter almonds, though too slight, I fancy, to signify anything so dramatic as poison. I mention it only because a detective who discards a fact as trivial before he understands it has generally discarded the very fact that would have solved his case." At this juncture a woman of perhaps 40 years, dressed with the neat severity proper to her station, entered the room in response to a summons from Bellamy. She was introduced as Miss Eleanor Price, the firm's chief clerk, a person, Bellamy assured us, of unimpeachable discretion and 20 years' faithful service. "Miss Price," said Holmes, "I understand that Mr. Croft remained late upon the evening in question." He did Mr. Holmes to finish certain copying work upon the Merivale papers. I remember it particularly, for he asked me not an hour before the offices closed at what time the injunction was expected to arrive from the court, and whether it would be locked away that same evening or left until morning. An unusual question for a copying clerk to ask. I thought little of it at the time. Mr. Croft has always shown a certain curiosity beyond his station, Mr. Holmes, though I would not have called it sinister until events proved otherwise. It was Vane, standing quietly near the window with his arms folded, who spoke next, and I confess his manner struck me then, as it had the day before, as that of a man wholly given over to the interests of his firm and his unfortunate junior clerk alike. I would not have Miss Price's honesty misconstrued into an accusation, Mr. Holmes. Croft is a foolish young man, and an unlucky one, but I have known him 3 years, and I should be sorry indeed to see circumstance alone convict him of so grave a theft. If there is any way in which I can assist your inquiry, in fairness to him as much as to the firm, you have only to ask it. "You're very ready with your assistance, Mr. Vane," said Holmes in a tone I could not quite read, whether of simple courtesy or something more reserved. "I may yet have occasion to accept it. For the present, I should like to see the copying room, and afterward the emergency envelope of which Mr. Bellamy has spoken. A case of this kind, gentlemen, is built not upon the single dramatic clue that announces itself, but upon a great many small and undramatic ones, patiently gathered until they can no longer be arranged in more than a single pattern." He returned the red case gently to the table, as though it were a thing that might yet be bruised by careless handling, and led the way from the deed-room with the quick, purposeful step that told me, better than any words could have done, that some thread had already begun to draw itself taut within his mind. Chapter 4. The Clerk's Blue Coat. We had scarcely finished our survey of the copying room, a low chamber crowded with desks and the sharp chemical smell of ink and blotting fluid, when a constable arrived with news that sent Lestrade hurrying from the building without ceremony. Croft's lodgings, it appeared, had yielded a discovery, and within the hour we learned that the clerk had been taken into custody. A torn envelope, Lestrade informed us that afternoon when we found him at the yard, plainly satisfied with the morning's work. "Found beneath the floorboard of his room, Mr. Holmes," and printed plain across it, the name of Harcourt, Bellamy and Vane. That, together with the money he can't account for and the caretaker's word that he carried a flat parcel out with him that night, seems to me evidence enough for any jury in England. "May I see the man?" Lestrade shrugged, as one indulging a harmless eccentricity, and led us to a small bare room where Nathaniel Croft sat with his head in his hands, a thin, sallow young man whose clothes, though clean, bore the unmistakable shabbiness of a person living beyond his means and paying dearly for it. "I never touched the injunction, sir," he said, before Holmes had asked a single question, his voice cracking with the particular desperation of a man who has told the truth so often that he no longer expects to be believed. "The money I had was from selling information about the horses, nothing more. I know men on the tracks who pay well for a word in season, and I'm not ashamed of it, whatever the inspector thinks." "And the envelope found beneath your floor?" "I copied dozens of papers in a week, Mr. Holmes. An old envelope means nothing. As for going back that second time, it was my coat I went for, my blue overcoat, which I'd left hanging in the passage when I finished my work. I'd no other reason to return." "You carried a parcel out with you, according to the caretaker." "My coat folded over my arm, sir, that was all, unless the old fool's eyes deceived him in the fog, which I'd not put past him." Holmes questioned him further, patiently and without any of the severity Lestrade had shown, drawing out the particulars of his evening, his debts, his acquaintances upon the turf, until at last he rose to go, remarking only, as we left the cell, "A frightened man, Watson, but frightened men are not always guilty men, whatever the inspector's experience may have taught him to the contrary." The evidence against Croft, however, continued to accumulate with a rapidity that even I found troubling. That evening at Baker Street, Lestrade called upon us in person, plainly gratified to be the bearer of further confirmation. "His coat has been examined, Mr. Holmes, and the fibres match precisely those found within the red case. There's more besides. A stick of red sealing wax was found among his effects, of the very sort used by the firm for its documents. And here, he produced a scrap of paper from his pocketbook, pencil notes in his own hand, giving measurements that answer very well to the dimensions of the steel cabinet itself. A messenger from a neighbouring chambers recalls seeing him, moreover, in the street near Sir Claudius Merivale's offices, 2 days before the theft. Holmes took the scrap of paper and studied it for a long moment beneath the lamp. The measurements are accurate, I grant you, though a clerk instructed to note the dimensions of a cabinet for the ordering of new deed boxes might record the same figures with entirely innocent purpose. Croft's coat, I observe, is a coarse navy serge, of the kind sold by the gross to any tailor supplying working men. The fibre taken from the red case, however, is a fine blue merino, softer and more closely woven. The distinction is not trivial, Lestrade. Whatever your experience inclines you to believe, a fibre is a fibre, Mr. Holmes. Blue is blue. A fibre is precisely as much a fibre as a signature is a signature, Inspector, and I have known men hanged upon a signature no more genuine than a schoolboy's forgery. I would have the merino compared under proper magnification with Croft's coat before it is permitted to condemn him. Lestrade, though visibly unconvinced, promised the comparison would be made, and took his leave in a temper somewhat cooler than that with which he had arrived. Holmes, left alone with me, drew from his pocket a small paper packet in which he had preserved, with characteristic foresight, a portion of the emergency key envelope from Harcourt's desk. "You examined that this morning," I said, while Lestrade was occupied with the window. "I did, and I confess it troubles me more than Croft's coat, or Croft's sealing wax, or Croft's unlucky habit of frequenting race courses. The wax seal upon this envelope appears, to a casual eye, entirely intact, precisely as Bellamy affixed it. Yet observe the paper beneath the seal, Watson, where it has been very slightly buckled, as though at some time exposed to a gentle and localized heat, of the kind produced by steam rather than by flame." I turned the fragment in my hand, and saw indeed a faint puckering of the paper's surface, so slight that I should never have remarked it unassisted. "You believe the seal was lifted and replaced?" "I believe it is a possibility that cannot yet be dismissed, and a possibility, moreover, that no examination of Croft's coat or Croft's debts will ever illuminate. There is one object more that has drawn my attention today, and I think it the most neglected of all." He described to me then the heavy brass document press standing in a corner of the copying room, its lower plate scoured recently and thoroughly clean, its upper plate left thick with the ordinary dust of disuse. "A press cleaned only upon one half," said he, "is a press that has been used for some particular purpose, and used moreover by someone who took the trouble to remove every trace of that purpose from the surface most likely to be examined, while forgetting, as the guilty so often do, that the surface less likely to be examined tells its own tale by its very cleanliness." He fell silent then, staring into the fire with a fixed inward look that I had learned never to interrupt, and I did not press him further, though I own that my own suspicions, so lately settled upon the unhappy Croft, had begun, under the quiet weight of these small contradictions, to loosen their hold upon my judgment. Chapter 5. The Men Behind the Injunction. The following day Holmes proposed a course of action that surprised me by its patience, though I had known him long enough to trust that patience in his hands was seldom idle. Rather than return at once to the deed-room, he resolved to see each person connected with the case separately, and in surroundings of their own choosing, that he might observe them, as he put it, unarmoured by one another's presence. We began with Bellamy, whom we found alone in his private office, a room as spare and orderly as the man himself, its shelves lined with calf-bound volumes whose spines showed the even wear of frequent careful use. "You ask me a delicate question, Mr. Holmes," said he, when Holmes had inquired whether the firm's past dealings with Merivale extended beyond the present dispute. "I will tell you this much, and no more, for the rest is bound by a confidence I cannot break, even to serve so worthy a cause as yours. Some years ago this firm acted for Sir Claudius in a private matter touching the true ownership of certain riverside properties, the very properties now in question. I will say only that the arrangement was not, in every particular, one I should care to see examined too closely in open court. And who within the firm conducted that earlier business? Bellamy hesitated, his fingers tightening upon the arm of his chair. I conducted it myself, Mr. Holmes, in its first stages. It was later, as the firm grew, that certain of its details passed into younger hands. I will say nothing further, and I beg you will not press me, for a solicitor's silence is not obstinacy but duty. Holmes didn't press him, though I saw the answer recorded itself somewhere behind that impassive face, to be weighed against whatever should come after. Harcourt, when we found him, proved more forthcoming, though his candour cost him visibly. My father invested heavily in Sir Claudius's companies some years before his death, he confessed. Seated at his desk with the air of a man delivering a confession he had rehearsed through a sleepless night. Should Merivale's empire fall, Mr. Holmes, I do not know that my family's fortunes would survive it. I tell you this freely, because I would rather you learned it from my own lips than suspected it from my manner, and because, whatever my private fears, I swear to you I have done nothing to hinder the course of justice. I believe you, Mr. Harcourt, though belief is a poor foundation for a case, and I shall want firmer ground before I am done. It was Miss Price who furnished the next thread, summoning us herself before the day was out, with a countenance more troubled than I had yet seen it. I have been examining the old account books, Mr. Holmes, as is my habit when anxiety keeps me from easier occupation, and I have found entries I cannot explain. Sums, small but regular, paid over some years into a client account long dormant, an account that should by rights contain nothing at all. Whose hand entered these sums? I cannot say with certainty, Mr. Holmes, for the entries are old, and initialled only in a manner not uncommon to the firm's practice. But I thought it my duty to bring the matter to your attention, whatever it may signify. We visited Croft once more in his cell, and there received an account that altered, in one important particular, the picture Holmes had been assembling. It was Mr. Vane, sir, who set me to measuring the cabinet shelves, near a month before any of this happened, said the clerk, his voice low and earnest. He told me new deed boxes were to be ordered, and asked me to note the dimensions exact. I thought nothing more of it until the inspector made such a matter of my pencil notes. Holmes received this intelligence with no more than a slight inclination of the head, though I, watching him closely, saw something settle behind his eyes, as a man sees the last piece of a difficult puzzle present itself, still separate from its fellows, but no longer in doubt of its place. Our final interview that day was the most singular. Sir Claudius Merivale received us in a town house of a magnificence that spoke eloquently, without a word from its owner, of the fortune now at hazard. He was a large, florid man, comfortable in manner but watchful in the eye, and he denied, with an ease I found difficult to credit as either wholly false or wholly true, any hand in the Injunction's disappearance. I'll not pretend I am sorry to see it lost, Mr. Holmes, for a delay of even a single day would let me transfer the disputed properties beyond the court's reach entirely, and I've no shame in saying so, since I broke no law in wishing it. But I did not arrange its theft, whatever your Inspector Lestrade may suppose. Someone, however, has approached you since, said Holmes, watching him narrowly. Merivale's easy manner faltered, only for an instant before he recovered it. You're well informed, sir. A note reached me yesterday, unsigned, offering to recover the injunction for a payment I need not specify. It named no method of delivery, only that I should prepare the funds and await further word. He produced the note, and Holmes bent over it beneath the window's grey light, his lens moving slowly across the typed characters. You will observe, Watson, said he at length, holding the paper toward me, that the lowercase letter E, throughout this communication, is struck slightly askew, as though the type bar itself has suffered some small injury. A machine so marked is as individual as a signature, and considerably harder to forge. You believe you can trace the machine that produced it? I believe, Watson, that a city contains a great many typewriters, but that the number of them within reach of this particular case is a great deal smaller, and that we have already stood within a room or two containing several such machines, without troubling ourselves to examine their keys. He folded the note carefully into his pocketbook, and as we descended once more into the fog-bound street, I observed in him that quiet contained energy which I had learned, over years of friendship, to recognise as the surest sign that the scattered threads of a case had begun, at last, to draw themselves into a single, coherent pattern. Chapter 6. A Reconstruction in Silence. Holmes said little on our way back to Lincoln's Inn that evening, and I had learned by then to leave him undisturbed in such moods, for his silences were seldom empty, whatever appearance they gave to a stranger. We arrived at the offices after the last of the clerks had gone, admitted by Bellamy himself, who had consented at Holmes's request to leave us the freedom of the premises for an hour. "I wish to test the room, Watson, rather than merely examine it," said Holmes, once we stood again within the deed-room, its high window now black with the night beyond. A fact observed once may deceive us. A fact reproduced under our own hands is a harder thing to doubt. He produced from his pocket a single sheet of ordinary paper, folded once, and directed me to place it within the red case exactly as the injunction was said to have been placed, to lock the case within the cabinet, to lock the cabinet itself, and then to leave the room entirely, closing the door behind me, while he remained without to observe whatever might be observed. I did as he asked, and returned some minutes later to find him crouched before the cabinet's rear panel, his lamp held close against the steel. "The cabinet's rear panel," he explained without looking up, "shares a common partition with the copying room beyond that wall. A tempting possibility, Watson, that some secret access might exist between the two, and one I was bound to eliminate before proceeding further." He rose, dusting his hands. "It does not exist, or if it does, no hand has opened it in years, for the joints are thick with old paint and undisturbed dust. We may set aside once and for all any notion of a hidden passage. The room is precisely as solid as it appears." "Then how?" "Patience, Watson. A solved mystery announced before its proof is assembled is worth nothing to a jury, and less to a friend who deserves better of me than guesswork." He led me next to the copying room, where the heavy brass press stood in its corner exactly as we had left it 2 days before. From his bag he drew a sheet of blotting paper, dampened it lightly at the tap in the corner, and laid it between the press's plates, closing them with a firm, practised turn of the handle. When he opened the press again and drew the paper free, I saw upon its surface, pressed there by the plate's uneven casting, a faint crescent-shaped mark, identical, so far as my eye could judge, to that we had found within the lining of the red leather case. "You see it, Watson? The crescent is no accident of the leather's manufacture, as I confess I first suspected it might be, but the signature of this very press stamped upon anything laid between its plates while damp. Then the injunction was pressed here. Something was pressed here, at least, and pressed while damp, which argues strongly that the document, whatever its ultimate fate, passed through this room in a condition it ought never to have possessed, a formal court paper having no proper business being dampened at all." He knelt beside the press's base and drew his lens across the floorboards beneath it. "Here, further, beneath the press itself, the same fine drying powder we found within the case, and here," he touched a small dark spot upon the boards and lifted it to his nose, "a drop of scented cleaning fluid, in which I detect again that faint suggestion of bitter almonds. A fluid used, I should think, by someone anxious to leave this press cleaner than he found it, and thorough enough to attend to the lower plate while forgetting in his haste the upper." We were interrupted at this point by Miss Price, who had remained late upon some pretext of her own, and who, hearing our voices, came to inquire whether she might be of service. Holmes asked her, almost idly, to recall once more the precise sequence of the injunction's arrival. "Mr. Vane brought it from the court himself, Mr. Holmes, as I have said. I remember he came directly to the copying room upon his return, remarking that he wished to correct a small error in a memorandum before it went further, and asking not to be disturbed. He remained there, I should think, some 10 minutes, perhaps a little more before he carried the case through to Mr. Bellamy to be locked away. 10 minutes, Holmes repeated softly. A brief interval, and yet sufficient, I think, for a great deal to be accomplished by a hand both quick and practised. When Vane himself appeared a short while later, drawn by the sound of voices, Holmes put the same question to him directly, and received an answer delivered with all his accustomed ease. "I merely corrected a memorandum, Mr. Holmes, as Miss Price says, and finding the press's lower plate marked with old ink, I confess I took a few moments to clean it, from habit rather than necessity. I am something of a precisian in small matters. You may ask anyone in these offices." "A commendable habit," said Holmes, in a tone so even that I could not tell whether it held irony or simple courtesy, though a curious one to exercise upon the very evening a court injunction passed briefly through your hands. "You do not suspect me, Mr. Holmes?" Vane's smile did not waver, though something in his eyes, I thought, had grown a shade more watchful. "I have laboured as hard as any man in this building to see the truth uncovered, whatever it cost the firm's good name. I suspect no one yet, Mr. Vane, and every one a little, which is, I find, the only honest condition in which to conduct an inquiry of this kind." He said no more upon the subject, and Vane, after a moment, withdrew with a bow that struck me as perfectly natural, though I own I watched him go with an unease I could not then have explained. It was not until we had left the building, and stood once more in the raw night air of Lincoln's Inn, that Holmes broke his silence upon the matter that had plainly occupied him throughout. "Tell me, Watson," said he, drawing his collar close against the damp, "is a document stolen in any meaningful sense if it never reached the place from which it is supposed to have vanished?" I confess the question struck me then as more curious than illuminating, and I told him so. He said nothing further, but I saw by the light of the nearest lamp that faint and private smile which told me, better than any explanation could have done, that the shape of the whole affair had begun to stand clear before him, however far it remained from standing clear before me. Chapter 7. The Ashes in Merivale's Grate. I had scarcely finished breakfast the following morning when Lestrade arrived at Baker Street in a state of undisguised triumph. His hat still upon his head, a thin coil of charred paper wrapped carefully in a handkerchief, and held before him as another man might have carried a trophy. "It's finished, Mr. Holmes, or as good as," he announced, laying the handkerchief upon our table with something approaching ceremony. "My men searched Merivale's town-house at first light, on a warrant I'll own I was glad enough to obtain, and found this in the library grate not fully consumed. You'll see for yourself what it is." Holmes unfolded the handkerchief with careful fingers and studied the fragment within, a curled and blackened corner of parchment, upon which a portion of an official seal remained faintly visible beneath its char. "Merivale's secretary has broken down entirely," Lestrade continued, unable to keep the satisfaction from his voice. "Admits that Croft came to the house secretly, the very night the injunction disappeared, and was let in by a side door. Croft himself has confessed to the visit, though he swears the parcel he carried held nothing but copied account sheets, given him, he says, at Mr. Vane's own request. But there's the injunction burned in Merivale's own grate, Mr. Holmes, and I think even you must allow that the case is closed." I confess that I too felt the weight of this discovery settle upon me with something like conviction. The chain seemed complete at last. Croft, driven by debt, had stolen the document and carried it to the one man with fortune enough to reward him. Merivale, seeing the danger past, had destroyed the evidence of his own guilt in the privacy of his hearth. Even Holmes's earlier misgivings, I thought, must surely yield before so tangible a proof. Merivale himself, when we confronted him within the hour, denied the charge with a vehemence that struck me this time as considerably less easy than his manner of 2 days before. "I never burned any such paper, Mr. Holmes, and I'll swear it before any court in the land. If parchment was found in my grate, it was placed there by another hand than mine." "Yet your own transfer papers for the disputed properties," said Lestrade, consulting his notebook with evident relish, "were prepared upon your solicitor's own testimony on that very evening. A curious coincidence, Sir Claudius, for a man who claims to know nothing of the Injunction's fate." "I prepared them," Merivale admitted, his colour rising, "because I had been promised, by whatever hand sent me that infernal note, that the Injunction would trouble me no further. A man does not refuse good fortune merely because he cannot yet account for it, Inspector, whatever suspicion that reticence may earn him." It was Holmes, throughout this exchange, who had said the least, occupying himself instead with the charred fragment, which he had begged leave to examine once more beneath a stronger light. When at last he spoke, it was in the quiet, measured tone that I had learned to associate with the emergence, at last, of some fact long sought and finally secured. "The seal upon this fragment, Lestrade, is impressed at an angle some 4 or 5 degrees from the vertical, if I judge rightly. I should like to compare it against the court's own register of dispatches, where the angle of every official seal struck that day is, I believe, recorded as a matter of routine precaution against forgery." "A few degrees of angle," said Lestrade, with the faint contempt of a practical man for a nicety he could not himself have measured, "is a slender thread to hang a case upon, Mr. Holmes, when I have a confession from Merivale's own secretary. It is a slender thread, I grant you, and I should not care to hang so much as a dog upon it alone. But observe this, Inspector, which I think a thread of a different weight entirely." He turned the fragment gently beneath his lens and indicated near its blackened corner a small round perforation, no larger than a pinhead, its edges seared but unmistakably present before the fire had touched them. "A pinhole, Lestrade, close by the corner of this fragment. You will recall that Mr. Harcourt, upon our very first evening, stated most particularly that the true Injunction had never been pinned, stitched, or bound to any other paper. It was folded once, and placed loose within the case. A document that was never pinned cannot burn bearing the mark of a pin, however completely the fire consumed the rest of it." A silence fell upon the room, broken at last by Lestrade, whose confidence, so buoyant an hour before, had visibly begun to waver. "You mean to tell me this isn't the Injunction at all?" "I mean to tell you, Inspector, that whatever burned in Sir Claudius Merivale's grate, it was not the document that vanished from that steel cabinet. It was a counterfeit, prepared with some care to resemble the original closely enough to deceive a hurried glance, and furnished, whether by accident or design, with a history of its own quite different from the Injunction's, a history that includes, at some point, being pinned to another sheet of paper." He folded the handkerchief once more about the fragment with a gentleness that seemed, to my eye, almost an apology to the truth it had so nearly been made to obscure. "Someone, gentlemen, has gone to very considerable trouble to persuade us that this case was already solved. I have generally found that the more perfectly a case appears to close itself, the more carefully it deserves to be reopened." Lestrade said nothing for a long moment, turning his hat slowly in his hands, and I saw in his face the particular discomfort of a practical man confronted with a fact his practicality could not accommodate. Merivale, for his part, watched Holmes with an expression in which relief and renewed alarm seemed oddly mingled, as though he understood that his own danger, far from ending, had merely assumed a shape he could not yet see clearly enough to fear it properly. For my own part, I walked from that house with the uncomfortable sensation of a man who has watched a solid floor reveal itself, beneath a single tap of the cane, to be no more than a painted cloth stretched over emptiness, and I wondered, as we returned once more toward Lincoln's Inn, what firmer ground Holmes imagined might yet be found beneath it. Chapter 8. The Document That Was Never There. Holmes spent the whole of the following morning at the Royal Courts of Justice, a labour he undertook alone, judging, as he told me afterward, that a solitary inquirer excites less comment among clerks jealous of their registers than two. I occupied myself in his absence with correspondence of my own, though I confess my thoughts strayed more than once toward Lincoln's Inn, and toward a certain courteous, dark-whiskered gentleman, whose openness had begun, in my mind at least, to assume a less reassuring aspect. He returned in the early afternoon with the particular brightness of manner that told me, before he had spoken a word, that his morning had not been wasted. The clerk's dispatch record, Watson, is a dull document to the ordinary eye, and a most illuminating one to any eye willing to be patient with it. 2 papers concerning the Merivale matter were sealed at the court on the afternoon in question. The first, the final injunction itself signed by the judge and dispatched under seal to Harcourt's chambers. The second, an unsigned draft, retained for the copying of certain clauses, and afterward marked, in the clerk's own hand, for destruction. A draft, I repeated. And was it pinned to anything? It was pinned, Watson, precisely as I had begun to suspect, to a sheet of blue backing paper, upon which some clerk's notes had been made in the margin. There is your pinhole accounted for, and accounted for in a manner that leaves no honest doubt remaining. The fragment burned in Merivale's grate was not the injunction at all. It was that discarded draft, its pin removed, its true character concealed beneath a hurried char. But how could the draft have left the court in place of the true injunction? That is the question I have spent my morning answering, and I believe I have answered it. Both documents passed for a brief interval through the same hands, Watson. The hands of the one person from this firm who attended the court that afternoon to receive them. Mr. Adrian Vane collected the signed injunction, as we already knew. What we did not know, until this morning, is that he also obtained temporary custody of the discarded draft, upon the pretext entirely plausible to a busy clerk of wishing to copy certain of its clauses for the firm's own records before it was destroyed. I own that the shape of the thing, though I had half suspected it since our reconstruction of the deed room, struck me now with a force I had not been prepared for. You believe he exchanged them then, before ever leaving the court? I believe he concealed the true injunction within his own portfolio at the very outset, and carried the draft back to Lincoln's Inn in its place, that draft afterward passing, under everyone's unsuspecting eyes, through precisely the ceremony of locking and sealing that should have protected the genuine article. Holmes drew from his pocket the anonymous note received by Merivale, and beside it a fresh sheet of paper, upon which he had evidently, during his morning's labours, obtained a specimen of type. I have visited also, Watson, the solicitor's own offices, and requested, with Bellamy's willing permission, a sample from each of the firm's typewriting machines. This sample was struck upon the instrument kept in Mr. Vane's private office. He laid the 2 sheets side by side beneath the lamp, and I saw at once, even without his lens, that the lowercase e in each bore the identical small defect, a faint askew quality in the lower curve of the letter, as though the type bar itself had suffered some old injury never repaired. There can be no mistaking it, I said, none whatever, and I have learned one further particular this morning, from a tailor in Jermyn Street with whom Mr. Vane deals, that he owns a scarf of fine blue merino, a garment answering very precisely to the character of the fibre found within the red case. A scarf alone, I grant you, proves little. A man may lose a thread from his muffler in a room he has entered for the most innocent of reasons, but joined to the type, to the press, to the powder, to the moisture upon the clasp, to the 10 unwatched minutes in the copying room, it ceases to be a single slender thread, and becomes instead one strand among a rope. And yet, I objected, for I own the notion still sat uneasily with me, Vane has behaved throughout with nothing but candour. It is Croft who lied about his errand, and Merivale who denied all knowledge until denial served him no longer. That, Watson, is precisely the difficulty that has occupied my thoughts since our first evening at Baker Street. A guilty man who lies clumsily convicts himself. A guilty man who assists the inquiry with every appearance of openness, who suggests our very involvement, who defends the suspect even as he arranges the suspect's ruin, commits a subtler crime than theft alone. He steals also our judgment, and very nearly succeeded in stealing mine. He rose and began to pace before the fire, as was his habit when a case approached its resolution. Consider the sequence of custody, Watson, stripped of every distraction. Vane alone possessed the court packet, injunction and draft together, before either paper entered the sight of a single other witness in this affair. Bellamy locked away a case whose true contents he never verified, for who verifies what a trusted partner has already sealed? Harcourt found a door undisturbed, because no door had ever needed to be disturbed. Croft was suspected because Croft was convenient, poor, and unwise enough to sell information about horses to disreputable men. The locked room was never the scene of the crime, Watson. It was merely the scene of the crime's concealment, manufactured with great care by a mind that understood, better than Lestrade himself, precisely what a room ought to look like when nothing has happened within it. He stopped before the window, looking out upon the fog that had once more begun to gather over Baker Street, thick and yellow and patient as the very deception it seemed that evening so aptly to resemble. There remains only the injunction itself to be found, Watson, and the motive that has driven a respectable solicitor to risk his liberty and his name in so elaborate a scheme. Both, I think, await us at Lincoln's Inn, and I believe the hour has come to gather every actor in this drama beneath a single roof, that the truth, once spoken, may be spoken but once. Chapter 9. The Impression Beneath the Seal. The boardroom of Harcourt, Bellamy and Vane, when we assembled there upon Holmes's request the following evening, had about it an air very different from the brisk professional dignity I had observed on our first visit. A long table of dark mahogany stood beneath a row of portraits depicting former partners of the firm, stern gentlemen in old-fashioned dress who seemed in the lamplight to watch the proceedings with an interest as keen as our own. Harcourt sat nearest the door, pale and restless. Bellamy occupied his accustomed chair with the rigid composure of a man determined to meet whatever came without visible alarm. Miss Price sat somewhat apart, a ledger before her, closed but ready. Lestrade stood near the window, his notebook open, his expression that of a man who had learned, over the past 2 days, to distrust his own certainty. Sir Claudius Merivale, summoned at Holmes's particular request, sat heavily at the table's far end, his colour high, his eyes moving continually toward the door as though he expected some further blow to fall upon him before the evening was out. Vane arrived last of all, composed as ever, and took the chair nearest Bellamy with a small courteous nod to the company, as though he too awaited with ordinary curiosity the conclusion of a puzzle in which he had played no more than a helpful part. "I have asked you here," Holmes began, standing at the table's head, "that I might lay before you, in its proper order, the history of a document that seemed to vanish from a locked room, and that never, in truth, entered that room at all." A murmur ran round the table, and I saw Vane's brows lift in an expression of polite astonishment, perfectly judged, that I could not, even now, wholly disbelieve. "On the afternoon in question," Holmes continued, "Mr. Vane attended the court to receive on the firm's behalf both the signed injunction and a discarded draft, pinned to a sheet of blue backing paper, which he had asked leave to copy before its destruction. He returned to these offices in possession of both papers, and of these 2 papers, only one ever reached the deed room." "This is monstrous, Mr. Holmes," said Vane, his voice steady, though I thought I detected for the first time a certain deliberateness in its steadiness, as of a man choosing each word with unusual care. I collected the injunction and delivered it, within the half-hour, to Mr. Bellamy's own hands. "You delivered a case, Mr. Vane, containing a paper that answered, to a casual glance, every outward appearance of the injunction, but you had, in the 10 minutes you spent alone in the copying-room, already removed the true document to your own portfolio and prepared the draft to take its place. You dampened the draft that its pinholes, left by the backing sheet, might be pressed flat beneath the plates of the brass press standing in that room, the same press whose lower plate you cleaned so thoroughly afterward, forgetting only the dust upon its upper surface, the fine powder used to dry the draft's ink, the moisture left upon the case's clasp, the crescent mark stamped by the press's uneven casting, All these travelled with the substituted paper into the red leather case, there to remain as evidence of a crime not yet suspected. "A press may be cleaned for 100 innocent reasons," said Vane, though his glance now moved for the briefest instant toward the door. "It may, but not every innocent reason accounts also for a reverse impression, taken by that same press upon damp transfer paper, of the draft's visible text and the position of its seal, an impression which permitted you afterward to prepare a convincing fragment, charred at its edges and left in Sir Claudius Merivale's own grate. That suspicion might fall upon a theft that had, in reality, occurred nowhere near that house." Merivale started forward in his chair. "You mean the parchment in my fireplace was placed there by this man?" "I do, Sir Claudius, though I do not think you entirely innocent of its purpose, since you were willing enough to purchase silence when the anonymous offer reached you." Holmes turned back to Vane without pausing. The emergency envelope in Mr. Harcourt's desk presented a further obstacle, since its seal, once broken, could not easily be restored. "You resolved this difficulty with steam, applied with sufficient care that the wax itself showed no visible disturbance, though the paper beneath it, examined closely, revealed a faint buckling no honest opening could have produced. With the key thus borrowed and returned, you unlocked the cabinet at your leisure, removed the true injunction from where it had never truly rested unwatched, and left the empty case to complete the illusion of a theft from a sealed and undisturbed room." "And Croft?" Lestrade demanded. "You'll tell me next he had no part in it at all." Croft's part was innocent, though he did not know it. Weeks before the theft, Mr. Vane instructed him to measure the cabinet's shelves, under the pretext of ordering new deed boxes, thereby manufacturing in advance the very notes that would later condemn him. On the night in question, he gave the clerk a parcel of copied account sheets to carry privately to Sir Claudius's house, a harmless enough errand in itself, but one that placed Croft, unknowing, at the scene most useful to his master's design. Miss Price opened the ledger before her at last, her hands trembling slightly. "The dormant account, Mr. Holmes. I have traced the entries as far back as I am able. They begin some years ago, and correspond, in date, to certain payments made by Sir Claudius through this firm. They will show, I believe, that Mr. Vane once assisted Sir Claudius in concealing the very fraud now before the courts, a service rendered under circumstances that would ruin his career should they come to light, and reveal besides that Adrian Vane practised law once before, under another name, in another country, from which he was dismissed for falsifying trust records, not unlike those Miss Price has just discovered. The coming trial threatened to expose all of it. His plan, once the injunction lay safely in his own hands, was to sell it back to Sir Claudius, secure funds enough to vanish beyond reach of either the law or his own history, and leave Nathaniel Croft to answer for a crime he never committed." Vane had risen from his chair, his composure at last entirely gone, his eyes moving swiftly toward the door where a constable now stood, summoned there, I understood, at Holmes's quiet instruction before ever we sat down. "You've built a fine structure of inference, Mr. Holmes, but inference is not proof." "Then let proof conclude it." Holmes drew from beneath his coat a slim, worn leather portfolio, its weight, as he set it upon the table, plainly greater than its slender appearance suggested. "Your own portfolio, Mr. Vane, surrendered this afternoon at my request, its unusual weight betraying a hollow compartment beneath its lining, along whose edge a keen eye may trace a faint straight ridge no honest workmanship would leave. He opened it, and drew from within a folded paper, sealed still with the unbroken mark of the court, which he laid upon the table before the assembled company. The injunction, gentlemen, precisely as it left the judge's hand, and never in all this while in any danger from Nathaniel Croft. Vane's face, in that final moment, lost at last every trace of the easy, reassuring warmth it had worn throughout our acquaintance, and I saw beneath it something colder and more calculating than I had allowed myself to suspect, even in my most uneasy moments. Miss Price laid before him, without a word, the account entries that completed the chain Holmes had already forged, and against that final, silent evidence, he offered no further denial. Chapter 10. The Law and the Fog. The injunction was served upon Sir Claudius Merivale before the week was out, in ample time to prevent the transfer of a single acre of the disputed properties, and I understand that the case which followed occupied the courts for the better part of a year, ending, as Holmes had privately predicted to me on the very evening of its resolution, in Merivale's conviction upon the original charge of fraud. Holmes was at pains, when the matter came before the magistrates, to make clear that whatever advantage Sir Claudius had hoped to draw from the theft, he had played no direct hand in its execution, a distinction that spared him one charge, while leaving the weightier one to run its course unhindered. Nathaniel Croft was released within 2 days of that evening in the boardroom, the case against him having dissolved as completely as the fog itself dissolves before a rising wind. He was not, I should say, an entirely blameless young man. His debts remained, and his dealings upon the racecourse were not such as any respectable employer could overlook without qualification. But Bellamy, whose rigid honesty I had at first mistaken for coldness, proved himself possessed of a decency that did the old man great credit, arranging for Croft a position with a firm of solicitors in Bristol, upon the single condition that he abandon the turf entirely and account for every shilling of his modest salary. Vane was arrested upon charges of theft, forgery, attempted extortion, and conspiracy to obstruct the course of justice, charges which I understand from a letter Holmes received some months later from Bellamy were pressed with the full severity the law allowed. His true history, once investigators abroad had been consulted, proved darker even than Holmes had ventured to suggest that evening, a career of quiet deception stretching back many years beneath more than one borrowed name. It struck me, reading of it afterward, that his ruin had come about not through any single dramatic error, but through a succession of small precautions, each reasonable in itself, that together had woven a pattern no honest transaction could have produced. Some days after the affair had reached its conclusion, Holmes and I sat once more before our own fire at Baker Street, the fog outside thinner now than it had been on the night of Harcourt's first visit, though still sufficient to blur the lamps along the street into soft, uncertain halos. "You solved, I think, one of the strangest cases within my recollection," I said, filling my pipe with the particular contentment that follows a difficult matter safely closed. "A theft from a locked room, and no thief who ever entered it. You're generous, Watson, as you have always been, but I think you credit me with more than I deserve. I did not solve an impossible theft. I merely observed, rather earlier than the police were willing to consider it, that the theft as described had never taken place at all." He leaned back in his chair, his eyes half closed, in the manner he adopted when a case, safely finished, permitted him at last the luxury of reflecting upon its shape rather than its solution. "The room was never the true scene of the crime, Watson. It only appeared so because every witness in that building, from the most junior clerk to the most senior partner, accepted without question the single assertion that the injunction had entered the cabinet at all. Once that assertion was accepted, the theft became impossible by definition, and an impossible theft, once believed in, invites only more elaborate explanations of how the impossible might have been managed. The true error lay not in any lock or window or wall, but in the first sentence of the story everyone had agreed to tell. Lestrade investigated how the document might have escaped a sealed room. Precisely so, and a natural enough error for a practical man to make, since it is always easier to ask how a thing happened than to ask whether it happened at all. I asked only the second question, and found, once I had asked it honestly, that the first question required no answer, since the injunction had never been where everyone supposed it to be. I thought of Vane then, as I had seen him first, courteous and reassuring beside the fire that very first evening, urging Harcourt to place his trust entirely in Holmes's hands, and I confess a small chill passed over me that had nothing to do with the night air beyond our window. He seemed, of every man in that firm, the least likely to deceive us, I said. I own I liked him from the first. That, Watson, was his true instrument, more subtle by far than steam or sealing wax or a stolen key. A man who offers his assistance freely, who defends the innocent even as he arranges their ruin, borrows a kind of protection that no lock can provide, for we are none of us inclined to suspect the hand that appears most eager to help us search. It is a lesson worth remembering, I think, whenever a case seems to solve itself with unusual ease. The most dangerous witness is rarely the one who lies to your face. It is the one who tells you with perfect sincerity exactly what you already wish to believe. We sat some while longer, in a silence broken only by the settling of the coals, and I found myself turning over, as I often did after such an evening, the particular quality of reasoning that had carried Holmes from 3 grains of sand to the whole architecture of a stranger's deception. It seemed to me, watching the last of the fog thin against our window, that his genius lay less in the discovery of new facts than in his refusal to accept, as everyone else had accepted, the false certainty that had settled, quiet and unnoticed, over the facts already lying before us all. Reason, I ventured at last, does not always show us something new then. Sometimes it merely clears away what never belonged there. Holmes opened his eyes and regarded me with that faint, approving smile he reserved for the rare occasions when I had, in his estimation, earned it honestly. You improve with every case, Watson, though I shall deny having said so if you ever quote me upon it. He rose and crossed to the window, drawing back the curtain upon a Baker Street grown suddenly, almost startlingly clear, its lamps burning steady and unblurred for the first time in a week. The fog lifts in its own time and asks no man's permission. It is perhaps the one honest witness in all of London, for it never pretends to be other than what it is. I said nothing further, content to let the fire and the quiet close the matter, as gently as the fog itself had closed at last, over Lincoln's Inn, and I thought, as I often thought at the end of such evenings, how fortunate I had been to witness, however imperfectly I might record it, the singular and searching mind of my friend.